Right, welcome to the Q&A. Again, I want to welcome to this Q&A. Question came in earlier, and it was a question about the end of days, the coming of the Messiah. Someone asked that the Messiah has to come, as we mentioned many times, by the year 6000, which not so far away, another couple hundred years. But the Messiah has to come before that. Seemingly has to come before that. So somebody asks, will the earth suffer? Will the earth suffer a polar flip within the next 1 to 200 years as a result? Then everything in the world would die, right? Basically everything needing the atmosphere, right? There will be no atmosphere at that point, I guess. So everything would die. And even if we did, let's say it's going to be, I don't know, meteors, asteroids, other things could destroy the Earth, right? Let's say it could destroy North and South Pole, radically reverse everything. The ice melts, right? All that. Leading to an unbalanced flip, which causes to make a quake about 1150, level 15, which, that would do quite a bit of damage. Then it caused so much damage, the atmosphere depletes and minutes to live on the ground till the final end. Could it be possible? It's possible. I mean, when it comes to the end of days, keep in mind, anything's possible. And I would probably say, when you least expect it, expect it. We don't know how it's going to be. Nobody knows. Nobody knows how it's going to be. Whoever knows, I would say is probably not talking. But at the same time, it could happen anywhere. At any given, at any given time, it could be worthy. Obviously, that does happen. But, in general, could things happen, global warming, these type of things where, the atmosphere gets destroyed and everyone dies? That's a possibility. Could there be a nuclear holocaust, nuclear war? Possibility. Right? Asteroids, the Earth maybe going too close to the sun. I don't know. A lot of things. There are a lot of potential, possibilities, that could happen. Nobody, no one really knows. But to answer the question, is this a possibility that could happen? Just as possible as anything else. I would think, though, a more plausible explanation of things that's going to happen is you're going to have this war of Gog and Magog, which the Malbim sets up more than 100 years ago. The Malbim says there's going to be war of Edom, i.e., Esav, the Western world, against Yishmael, right? Against Islam. Then they're gonna, they're gonna fight because of differences of opinion and religion. They're gonna say, why are we fighting? Why should we be fighting each other? Whose fault is it? Of course, it's the Jews' fault. Because it's the Jews' fault, let's wage war against them. They're going to come march to Jerusalem, and then the Messiah is going to come. Now, before 9/11, you wouldn't think, this would even be plausible, right? That, they'd have such, power and different things in a lot of places in the world. But again, if someone would pin me down and say, well, what do you really think, what do you really think is going to happen? I mean, that's, I think it's on the board. I think for sure it's on the board. It's just, it's just a matter of when. But, could it happen other ways? Could it happen other ways? There are 1.5 million different ways, different scenarios that it could happen. And at the end of the day, nobody knows, right? Nobody really has any clue how it's going to be. Could be their global, warming issue, so to speak. Could happen, right? So, certainly it's not out of the realm of reality. Certainly not. But if you look at what's on the ground right now, the fact that you do have nuclear weapons out there, and the students of the Vilna Gaon more than 300 years ago said in the name of the Vilna Gaon, Rabbi Elijah Vilna, that this war of Gog and Magog is going to take 12 minutes. Now, I'm talking 300 years ago, it's before missiles, before airplanes, before anything, right? So, that sounds like, it sounds like missiles, sounds nuclear, you know. So, we'll see. We'll see what gets carried out and what happens. But the world's a powder keg waiting to explode, and everywhere in the world, pretty much, has had problems with Muslims, right? They're just every country, except for Japan. Japan hasn't had a problem because they don't let them in. So that's why they haven't had a problem. But you got significant minorities all over Europe, certainly in America, in other places. They're not interested in conforming, society around them. They're interested in basically taking over the world. Everyone doesn't believe like them, is an infidel and deserves to die. And we see what goes on in the world. So again, if I was the betting man and, all the money I don't have, I would think that's the scenario. I would think that's what's going to happen. It doesn't have to happen that way, but I think the writing's on the wall, and I think eventually that's going to lead to this final global war, so to speak, and then the Messiah is going to come. I mean, I think, like I said, I think the writing's on the wall for that, but it doesn't mean it has to happen that way. It can happen in a million different ways. Any scenario potentially. Any scenario is possible. Yeah, nothing that is it's nothing off the board. There's nothing off the board, so to speak. That a potential thing couldn't happen. At the end of days. But nobody knows. Nobody knows. It seems that, a third of the world's going to get destroyed, a third of the world's going to get survived, a third of the world will be injured. It's going to take 8 months. 8 months, I think, as the prophet says, to bury people. So it doesn't sound necessarily nuclear, because otherwise you just, disintegrate, evaporate, whatever. So, imagine what that is, 8 months. 8 months, day in and day out, burying people. I mean, that's, whatever. It's a good chunk of the world. It's gonna get destroyed, right? Most of the known world will get destroyed. People in the world. So, how it's gonna happen? Anybody's guess. Anybody's guess. I would say, it is an interesting topic. The Rambam and others say you should never try and, go through the verse and try and figure out when the Messiah is going to come according to your calculation, because if your calculation is wrong, you say, oh, it's not true, and then a person, will not want to keep Torah mitzvahs at all. So, there's a lot of hiddenness, tremendous amount of hiddenness in this topic. There's a lot of contradiction in the verses themselves. So, and again, for former Christian, favorite topic, no question. No question, because according to them, it's all about JC and coming back and, whatever. Okay. Yeah, but, for most people, for most Orthodox Jews, just, keeping this in perspective, everybody agrees, right? Everybody agrees we're living in the Messianic era, right? The Gemara in Sota says there are 15 signs. 15 signs that show beyond the shadow of a doubt this is the Messianic era. Okay, so nobody disagrees. Now, even though everything's right for the Messiah to come, I mean, seemingly we're very close, at the end of the day, how is it going to happen? Nobody knows. Whoever knows, like I said, it's not talking. So, for most Orthodox Jews, I mean, it's an interesting topic. It's an interesting subject that has no relevance to our lives. Right? Still got to pay our bills, get to the end of the month, got to do what we need to do. We're going to keep Torah mitzvahs, whatever we need to do. It doesn't really affect us that much. I mean, what affects us is what goes on around us. Now, Could these things going on around us lead to the end of days? Sure, it could. No one's saying not. But sit there and figure it out, and that's the only topic that's important. But in everyday life, it has no relevance, right? You got to believe in it. You got to believe in the coming of the Messiah, just like even if he, as we say in the Ani-Mami, that we believe in perfect faith, even if he tarries, even if he delays in coming, we still believe he's going to come. Very good. Okay, so Rabbi Cheskel Bronsky, a blessed memory, had a base in London many years ago, and Torah Giants, the last generation, according to everybody, no question. And he said it's like waiting for, you have an appointment. You have an appointment with someone 9 o'clock. So you're waiting, for that person to come. Yeah, that person's supposed to come at 9 o'clock. That's what it means to wait. It's like you're expecting something. Expecting someone to come. Very good. Right? How many people living their lives like that? It's also a good question. But the point is, what's going on? I have to believe in the coming of the Messiah. It's true. It's strengthen ourselves in the moon of that is the test of this generation before the Messiah comes. Right? Our test in faith and belief in God, as we always say. That's very true. Okay, but in practical terms, if it comes this way, Messiah comes this way, that way, the other way, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. We have to survive. We have to do our best to survive. So who's going to survive? The only people that are going to survive are those that are attached to Torah mitzvahs. As a Jew and as a non-Jew, keeping the Noahide laws, keeping the universal laws. Everyone else, if they're involved in idolatry, they're wiped out. Right? One of the Noahide laws, unless they repent. So they're totally going to be wiped out. All the atheists, they'll be wiped out. Right? So, a good chunk of the world are going to be wiped out. That's what we know. Right? That's really what we know. Otherwise, practically speaking, it doesn't really matter because, I have to get up in the morning. I have to pray. Right? I have other mitzvahs to do acts of loving kindness, got to help others, whatever it is. Whatever we need to do, that's what we need to do. Okay, this is a very interesting topic. Tremendously interesting topic. But, the Christians, it's like the topic. Right? That's why, I get people are into it because it's their topic. Yeah. That's like their most important topic. How he's coming back, when he's coming back. Right? Whatever it is. That's their topic. Okay. For us, it's interesting. We believe it's going to happen. It's going to happen sometime in the future. It's going to happen within, 6,000 years. Even, so the next 200 some odd years. Hopefully it'll come speedily in our days. Very good. Otherwise, what relevance does it have to our lives? Doesn't. What has relevance is, if I'm a Jew, what blessings do I make? How do I pray? What are other things, right? How much do I have to learn? Or a Jew in training, same thing, right? I have to know what to do, etc. So that, that's important. Learning Hebrew, knowing how to pray, knowing blessings, knowing kashrus, knowing Shabbos. These things are important. These things are crucial. Now, the end of days, interesting. It's an interesting topic. I don't think there's any questions, an interesting topic. But at the end of the day, what's the relevance? Right? What is the relevance to our lives on a regular basis? Right? On a daily basis. Doesn't have any relevance. Right? I gotta believe it every day, very good. One of the 13, principles that we should say every day. Right? It has an effect on us. When we say it. More than that, again, as extracurricular activity. The person wants to, go through the verses, go through the prophets. Very good. If you want to, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with it. It's a very interesting, topic. See what the prophets say, what it means, etc. But relevance in our lives does not have practical relevance. We don't have so much practical relevance. What has practical relevance is what I do. That is practical relevance, right? And how much I learn and how I deal with others and my relationship, between me and God. That is relevance, right? That's important. How I deal with other things. That's important. This, okay, I want, I would put it on the top 10 list. of most important things, I'll do in my life right now, because it's not relevant. It's the only thing that's relevant is with all the craziness going on in the world, right? And the fact that we have to work on our emunah and our faith and belief in God, that's the strongest thing we have to work on. Okay. That's in this context. Why is it in the context? Because we're living in the Messianic era. So we're living in the Messianic era. That's what I have to, that's what I have to work on. That is something significant I have to work on. Okay. Now, vis-a-vis whether Messiah can come tomorrow, the next day, or whenever it's going to be, okay. I'm not thinking about that. If it's thinking about that, or like you got 5 bills to pay, you don't know where money's coming from. Like that's more of an important topic. That's more an important topic. Yeah, it's an interesting topic. I'm not saying not. Right? It is an interesting topic. But on a practical level, for us, it doesn't really have that much relevance. More relevance is again making blessings, learning Hebrew, keeping kosher, keeping Shabbos. That is relevance. Right? There's a lot more relevance. Now, vis-a-vis what I do and how I interact with others, and I have to work on character development and being a better person, interacting better with others, great. That is a lot more practicality, right? That's more practical, for sure. This other stuff's interesting. Interesting things don't necessarily mean it has any practical ramifications. So right now, it doesn't have any practical ramifications. Hear people talk about, building vessels for the next temple, let's say. They put all their effort into that. Okay, who says we're going to use them? Right? It's also a good question. Yeah, you have Temple Institute in Jerusalem that's, busy working on these things. But who says we're going to use them? A lot of temple vessels we believe are either in Rome or buried somewhere here in Israel. There's one person every generation that knows where they are, right? So, there are people have what I call, their mitzvahs. Like certain things that they, that they focus on. Okay. But again, is that the most important thing? And then, they'll say it's an important thing. Messiah's coming, got to prepare. So we have to have all these vessels. But again, according to them, they'll say we're going to use these vessels. Okay. And everybody else? What's everyone else hold? Think we're going to be able to use them or not? Right? Wouldn't it be kind of ironic, spend years and years doing this and building these things and we can't use them. And when the Messiah comes, they won't be used. So one time we want to teach others about the mitzvah, very good. Nothing wrong with it. Definitely nothing wrong with it. Right? But, obviously, but it's not the mitzvah. Right? Plenty of other mitzvahs. Prayer is a big mitzvah. Giving charity is a big mitzvah. Helping others is a big mitzvah. Keeping Shabbos if you're a Jew is a big mitzvah. Does this trump it? Doesn't trump it. Doesn't, you don't, what's the word? It doesn't supersede the laws of Shabbos. You don't build them on Shabbos, you're not allowed to. Even the Messiah would be here today. Yeah, still going to be keeping Shabbos, right? So you want to use these vessels, you can't build them. Doesn't supersede Shabbos. Yeah, certain things are obviously more important. Forget it, people dedicating their lives to this. Okay. But they have to keep other things. It's not the only mitzvah in the world. Right? And who says, and who says it's one of the mitzvahs to build them? Maybe it shouldn't be done. Maybe it's a total waste of time. If God promises that the other vessels, they're buried somewhere or they're in Rome, we'll get them back, we can fix them up and use them, then they wasted all their time. If they taught other people, very good. So it's an education project. Okay. Right? That I can hear. But it may not have any practical relevance. So you can say, wow, they could have been learning Torah. They could have been other things. But, if they're teaching other people, getting people into this mitzvah, whatever, and getting more people into Judaism, okay, it's worth something. definitely worth something. But doesn't, but what does it supersede? Does it supersede learning Torah? These are big questions. You can do that, not learn Torah, and just focus on that your whole life. I don't know. I wouldn't think so. I don't think the majority of rabbinic authorities would tell you to do that either. There are people who say, we got our own rabbinic authorities that are telling us, okay. I'm saying the vast majority wouldn't tell you. Wouldn't tell you that. So, so again, there are things that have more, more practical ramifications, and there are things that don't. So I'm just using this as an example, but some people will get carried away and like they'll spend all their time learning all about, all these verses in Tanakh. Okay. You want to learn Tanakh, very good. Plenty of other things to learn also. For someone to be considered a rabbinic scholar today, they have to know all 24 books very well. I mean, how many people really know the 24 books of Tanakh very well? I mean, but that's not the only thing you're learning. So, it's good. It's interesting. It's, it's about the history of Jewish people. Very good. I have to learn how to keep Shabbos. It was a question of like learning a number of verses, and that's all I can do, and not learn how to keep Shabbos, then, you have to learn how to keep Shabbos first. You have to learn how to make blessings first. You have to learn other things first. You have to try and find time to learn this also. Yeah. And that, and a lot of people don't learn it today because there are contradictions. There are seemingly contradictions between Tanakh and the Torah. Now there are answers. Not like there aren't any answers. Right? The kids learn this, learn all these stories, different things in Tanakh when they're younger. And then barely anyone picks up any, over the years, people barely pick up any books in Tanakh to learn it. Yeah, busy learning Gemara, they're learning Halacha, they're learning, Jewish law, they're learning other things. Okay. But isn't this important to learn? It's also important to learn. No question. A lot of the Torah is based on this. The Torah is based on this. The Gemara quotes Tanakh all the time. Quotes the Torah a lot. Quotes Tanakh a lot. Like, you gotta understand a lot of these stories at face value don't make a lot of sense. And there's a lot of other things going on. That's why, that's why it's ironic. First of all, you get people that cherry pick their verses, which we've spoken about that. But in general, people look at things at face value, totally at face value, but they don't understand what's going on behind the scenes. There's a lot of depth going on behind the scenes. Anyone who's learned, Tanakh in depth the right way, they know. 100% they know that what goes on, what we see is a fraction of what's going on behind the scenes. Right? So then you're getting all the information. Then you're getting the whole picture. But if you don't get the whole picture, you don't even get any of the picture. So then you can say whatever you want. You can make it up as you go along. You tell me it's a hint for this, and a hint for that, and a hint for something else. But it doesn't say it. Not only doesn't say it, it's probably a bad translation anyway. Or mistranslation. But we've spoken enough about that also. So in general, sometimes even in Torah, right? Even in learning, people get distracted. Why? Why do they get distracted? Very simple, because they focus on things that, don't have such practical relevance. I'm talking about when you need to learn other things. So if you only have a certain amount of time, to learn, you want to learn, person would want to learn those things that are probably most practical. Most practical what I need to do, right? Whether it's a Jew or a non-Jew, right? For Jews, they want to learn. So I have to learn things that are practical. Okay. Now, can I learn other things as well? What about Shmir Salasha? What about laws of Lashon Hara? That's important to learn. Yeah. Chumash, it's important to learn. Tanakh, it's important to learn. Jewish law is important to learn. I mean, you're going to find time. A person got to find time. But a person should also learn what they enjoy. Not just what they're, not just what they're obligated to. So, you have to find a balance. And some people enjoy learning more, about, more Jewish law. Some people more esoteric things, midrashim, let's say, Jewish history, Jewish philosophy, Musar. Okay. Certain things, I think a person should learn every day anyway, regardless whether they enjoy it so much or not, but everyone has their niche. Everyone's soul can attach to something that, they have an affinity to. And like I said, some will be more into esoteric things. Some will be more into, how the law works and what the law is and what I have to do and, all that. But everyone has to know what to do. So if you have a limited amount of time, what takes precedence? Right? That's the question. What takes precedence? So what takes precedence is what I need to do practically. That will always take precedence. The other things I'm not saying are not important. They are important. They're for sure important. But, if you veer off a little bit and you start learning things that are less important than the things that are more important, you won't know what to do. Right? And that's going to be a tragedy because, then you spent a lot of time learning interesting things, definitely interesting things, but practically speaking, if someone wants to convert, it's not going to help them. Jewish history is very interesting. Okay. Is that one of the criteria in conversion? Not necessarily. That someone, wanted to marry a Jew, but they were serious about conversion and they were much older. So synagogue they were in, they took, I don't know, I think there was a Hebrew class, a history class, maybe a class of Mishnah, like one other class. And basically, out of like 4 or 5 classes, one class, or maybe even 1.5 classes, was practical. 1 out of 5. Let's say 1 out of 5. So I said it's probably going to take you 250 years to convert. By that time, you'll be dead. They want you to die before you convert to see if you're serious. So yeah, you're probably right. So like, other classes are interesting. Yeah, they're interesting. Okay, but even if they're interesting, what does it help me? Well, in everyday life. Sorry, let's say better. Practically speaking, there's a criteria what I need to know. Going in front of a rabbinical court. You think they're going to ask you like all these questions Jewish history? No. Shouldn't a person learn Chumash and Tanakh? Yes. Are they going to ask you about it? They might ask you some things in Chumash, maybe. They may ask you some, certain things. Yeah, but where's the majority questions going to come? Majority questions are going to come from what's practical. How to use a hot plate on Shabbos. That's practical. What's a blessing over strawberries? That's practical. What are the 39 categories I can't do on the Sabbath? That's practical. Yeah. These other things, maybe. Maybe get one question about something like, something in Tanakh, something in Chumash. They're never going to ask you that. They'll ask you maybe, if you learn Chumash every week, if you learn the Parsha, the Torah portion of the week every week, okay. But that's also very good to do, right? To know what goes on and, what the verses mean and all that and what's going on every week. Very good. That should be done. Are they going to ask you about it? Not necessarily. Do I have to know it anyway? Sure, you have to know it. Yeah, because you're going to focus on that maybe once a week, maybe a few times a week. I don't know. But certainly on Shabbos, yeah, that's something to learn. And you learn other things. You can learn, more practical things also. Very good. But that's what they're going to ask you. Things that aren't practical is extra. It's extra. They're going to ask you, did you learn Musar every day? Did you learn ethics every day? No. They're not going to ask you that. How many times you go through Paths of the Just? They're not going to ask you that. Probably not even part of the curriculum. Might be, but I doubt it. They're not going to ask you that. They ask you things that are much more practical. That's what they're going to ask you. So this topic, not practical. Right? There's no practice. It has almost no relevance in our lives. Almost. I mean, you got to believe in it. You got to believe, like, the Messiah comes, just like you're waiting for someone to come at 9 o'clock. Very good. So that is practicality. Yeah, some level of practicality. More than that, you want to delve into it? That's great. It's extra credit. That's extra credit. Because other things, the whole point is, if you would focus on things that are less important, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? You're going to go in front of a basin. You're going to go in front of a basin, and you're not going to be able to answer any of their questions. Any of their questions you won't know. They'll say, how do you use all plate on Shabbos? Oh, I haven't got there yet. I'm still working on, Daniel chapter 9. I'm still working on, I'm still working on, Jeremiah Jeremiah chapter 30. I'm working on these other things. Okay. But they don't care about that. They absolutely don't care about that. They want to know, do you know how to, use a hot plate on Shabbos or not? And if you don't, you can transgress Torah prohibitions. That's what they want to know. They want to know, you know how to make blessings, you know how to read from a prayer book. Yeah. Can you follow a prayer service? They don't care if you speak Hebrew like an Israeli. They want to see, can you follow a prayer service? That's important. Yeah, that's important. How fast you read is also important. You got to keep up. You certainly have to keep up. Yeah, you can skip around if you're late or you say things slower. Okay, that's a whole another thing. Right? But they want to see. You're at home, you wash for bread, you say grace after meals. You have to know how to say it. You have to know, let's say better, you have to know how to read it for a prayer book. So if it's transliterated, it's easier. I won't tell people to do it because once you learn Hebrew, it's going to be harder to, once you learn Hebrew properly, then you might be pronouncing words wrong now. So you have to go back and fix it. But other people say it's a quick fix. At least you can say the words. Okay. But that's important. How to follow a service. That's important. How to read Hebrew. That's important. Yeah. These other things that are interesting. Yeah. Interesting doesn't mean it's practical. Right? And for the most part, what does the person want to concentrate on? Things that are practical. Now, you got extra time. You want to learn other things. Okay. But you have to focus on the main thing. Right? And the main thing is I want to get to the finish line if you want to convert. Right? That's the main thing. And that's the focus. So, a person will say, but you have to learn about Jewish history. And you have to learn Tanakh. And you have to learn Chumash. Right? It's true. You have to learn it. And you learn Musar every day. 10 minutes a day, 15 minutes a day. Yeah. When are you going to find the time? You got to find the time. Person has to make time. But you got to make time for the most important things first. I see this all the time. The things that are most important, people push to the side. The things like this, for instance, which is an interesting topic, but absolutely has no relevance to our lives, that's what they focus on. I understand, because of their background and whatever. I get it. But that's not the most important thing. Again, on a scale of 1 to 10. On a scale of 1 to 10 for Orthodox Jews. The whole thing about the end of days and all the verses, and the contradictions and everything else. Where does it come into the scale of 1 to 10 most important things? Yeah. Probably about 10,250. That's where it comes. There's no practicality. No practicality. It's interesting. Okay. There are a lot of things that are interesting. Yeah, I got to stay focused. Got to keep my eye on the ball. Don't want to get distracted. Because you get distracted, in other things, which is interesting. Which is definitely interesting. You get credit for knowing it and going through it. Okay. But in everyday life, when you can't do basic things that you need to do, God's not going to be so happy with that. Right? Certainly rabbinical court won't be happy with that. You say, well, I learned, Jeremiah, I know Jeremiah, backwards and forwards. I know it verbatim. Quote you this thing and that thing and the other thing. This is great. What's a blessing over strawberry? How do I use a hot plate? And the person's like, they're not going to care if you can read Jeremiah backwards and forwards. They're not going to care about that. There's no relevance. There's no relevance. It's good to know. Something we have to know at some point, right? Something a Jew needs to know is to learn Tanakh very well. Okay, I hear that. And learn the Bible very well. Learn the 5 books of Moses very good. Yeah, also important. Definitely also important. But that's not the main criteria. Yeah. Should a person go through it every week? Yes. 100%. Yeah. Torah portions of the week? Yeah. You should go through it every week. Read it with Rashi, read it with a good translation, right? Go through it. You know what's going on during the week. Very good. Yeah. That should be done. That can be done on Shabbos, right? But again, you got to focus on other things also. And the other, I'm not going to say the other things trump it per se, because the person has to know Chumash. Well, unfortunately, a lot of people don't know Chumash well. They certainly know Chumash and Rashi. They certainly don't know Chumash and Rashi well, even they were born religious. Right? It's just not a focus. It should be. Brisker of blessed memory once said, that there's an obligation for a Jew, it applies to a guy more than a woman, but for a Jew to read the parsha twice in the Aramaic translation. Yeah, should read it twice. So some people do it, aliyah by aliyah. Some people read the whole part, read it once, then read a second time, read the whole parsha, and then read the Aramaic translation. I don't know that, if you don't understand Aramaic, something you can read in English, something you can learn Rashi, right? Whatever it is. Anyway, the Brisker Reb says, this is one of the commandments, that if you do it, what is the omen for this? What is the reward for this? Aricha Shomin. You get long life. So the Brisker Reb said, this is such an easy thing to do. I obviously got to find time to do it during the week. Okay. But the easiest thing to do, right? If you know how to read Hebrew, it's not going to take you very long. Right? I mean, like this week you got a double portion, so it's very long, but okay. Most weeks you can do it. You split it up, whatever it is. You do a little bit every day. You finish by the end of the week. Okay. So the Brisker Reb said, this is something, a lot of people don't do it really in depth. Don't do it the way they should. But he said it's the easiest thing to do. But not only that, you get a Reich Shomim, you get long life. So why don't people do it? He said the easiest thing to do. What are the easiest things to do? As long as you read Hebrew, whatever, it's not so hard to do. Not so hard to do at all. Some of the Torah portions are not that long. So he says, so why don't people do it? What was the answer? What was the obvious answer? The obvious answer is people are lazy. They're learning this Gemara, I'm learning, whatever, I'm learning this commentary, that commentary, I'm all caught up in these other things. Very good. But this is the easiest thing. So I'm not saying it should take precedent over maybe other things. You find time to do it. Okay. You find time to do it, even if a person's focused on other things. Okay. Right? But that's the answer. A lot of people do it. A lot of people do it because they're lazy. But there's another thing. When you learn Rashi, also, if you want fear of heaven, you learn Chumash and Rashi. Because you see the greatness of Rashi, what he does. And how he understands the verse, and how he has the entire Torah in front of him. How he picks from this measure to that measure, this Gemara, this, that, whatever it is. Give you fear of heaven. Tremendous fear of heaven. It's also a good thing. Definitely a good thing. Now non-Jews certainly don't have an obligation on that. But certainly for Jews, it's certainly, people should do it every week. The Brisker Reb said, why don't people do it? It's the easiest thing. Why don't people do it? I don't think go to Rashi if you want to sit on it, and see what he says, and you analyze it, see some of the other commentaries, what they say about it. Okay. But at the end of the day, why don't people do it? Why don't people do it in general? Says the Brisker Reb, people are lazy. People are lazy. He said, but it's the easiest thing to do. Essentially, it's the easiest thing to do. You read through it, and that's it. Okay, you got to think about it, what's going on, whatever. You can spend hours doing it, true. But then even just reading through it, getting a simple understanding what Rashi says, give you fear of heaven, right? It'll give you long life, the easiest thing to do. So why don't people do it, says the Brisker Reb, because they're lazy. Yeah? I mean, it's mind-boggling, right? It's mind-boggling when, if you think about it. Somebody asks, let's deal with this. Would men receive more difficult questions than women for a rabbinical court, considering that women are supposed to learn the Gemara? Well, they're not going to, first of all, the rabbinical court's not going to ask men questions of the Gemara. Yeah, they're not going to ask them that. And the reason they're not going to ask them that is because they shouldn't be learning it before conversion. Now, if they're learning something, they're learning Chumash, and they see Rashi, and Rashi brings up a Medrash, or Rashi brings up, a Gemara, okay. Right? They shouldn't learn it in depth. They hear about it, they saw it, very good. Right? They should move on. Shouldn't be learning it in depth. Oral law is forbidden in general. Right? In general for non-Jews. But they're not going to ask you that. They're going to ask you very practical questions. A woman has to keep Shabbos. Woman has to keep kosher. Woman has to keep the holidays. Woman has to make blessings. No difference. Men and women, the same obligations over here. Prayer is a little bit different. Women have to know how to pray, for sure. right? Those obligations are not the same. Men have greater obligations than that. Okay. But learning is a different thing. They're not going to ask about that. They're obviously going to want to see that when a person, if they pass everything they need to do, then, they want to see that they're actually, their learning doesn't stop at this point. This is just the beginning, and, they continue to learn whatever they're going to do. What about reading Hebrew? Aren't women not allowed to learn Hebrew? Why not? Why shouldn't they learn? Why shouldn't they be allowed to learn Hebrew? How are you going to learn from a prayer book if you don't learn how to read Hebrew? Women have absolutely every obligation to learn Hebrew. Girls taught from a very young age to learn how to read Hebrew. They also have to learn how to pray. Women, where do you see in any community, any Orthodox communities, women don't learn Hebrew? They learn Hebrew, for sure they learn Hebrew. They have to learn Hebrew. Girls growing up, a lot what they do, a lot of what they learn Tanakh very well, very in depth. They probably know Tanakh inside and out, and Chumash inside and out much better than men. Because men don't learn it, right? Guys don't learn it. They learn Gemara. Women don't learn Gemara. Okay. Yeah. Of course they have to learn Hebrew. How are they going to learn the text inside? How are they going to learn the commentaries inside? If they don't know Hebrew. They have to learn Hebrew. They learn Rashi script, right? Because that's what it's written in. That's what the commentaries are written in, and usually, in Rashi script. So if they couldn't learn Hebrew, or they couldn't learn Rashi script, they wouldn't be able to learn anything. So Sarah Schneer came on the scene, saw what was going on, and took upon herself to start this whole Beis Yaakov movement, 1700s, 1800s, or sorry, 1900s even. Sorry, it was 1900s. Some people were opposed to it, but the vast majority of, great rabbis of the generation, were for it, for women's education. And part of that women's education, the aleph base, no pun intended, of women's education is learning Hebrew, learning how to learn. Learning how to learn scripture. Learn how to learn the commentaries. And Tanakh and Chumash and, and all that. So where do you see that that's not the case? Where do you see that, women are not allowed to learn? That's in every community, in every Orthodox community, from a very young age, they learn Hebrew. For sure they learn Hebrew. It could be in Hasidic communities. Yeah, they'll learn Yiddish, okay, but all the commentaries are in Hebrew. So maybe they'll, when they learn in Hebrew, they'll explain it in Yiddish. Yiddish, tremendously, holy language. Okay, but doesn't matter. Even if they only speak in Yiddish, Yiddish is not going to help them if they can't read Hebrew or they can't understand Hebrew. So they are learning Hebrew. They might, explain it in Yiddish. Okay. And not speaking Hebrew is a different issue. That has nothing to do with learning. Speaking Hebrew, they'll say you're only going to speak Lashon HaKodesh, right? The holy tongue. It's not the modern Hebrew, right? So, a lot of Hasidic people will only speak Yiddish for that reason. Because it's holier than the language, right? It's holier than the Hebrew they use now. It's not called Lashon HaKodesh. Big difference, right? Without going into it, it's a big difference. So that's a whole different thing, and they have to go against the Zionists for bringing back Hebrew and this, what they use Hebrew for and some of the words they use, and that's a different thing. We're learning how to pray, right? They're praying in Hebrew, right? They're praying from a prayer book in Hebrew. It's not Yiddish. They are not praying in Yiddish, I can tell you. There are certain things in the prayer book said in Aramaic, okay. But they're also going to say in Aramaic. 100% they're going to say in Aramaic. And whatever is not in Aramaic, which is most of the prayer book's in Hebrew. So what do you think they're speaking in? What do you think they're praying in? Not praying in Yiddish, 100%. They are not praying in Yiddish. They may speak in Yiddish, doesn't matter. They're not praying that language. They're praying in Hebrew. And whatever few things we say during the service, which isn't much, when it comes to things in Aramaic, that's a big difference, right? Could be that's what they meant, and not learning Hebrew. That's different. Because again, if they didn't learn Hebrew, they can never open up a Chumash and understand it. They would never know. So it could be that's what they were talking about. Somebody asked, what does it mean? Shem will show us his and who is holy. And you come near to him. Even him who he has chosen will cause to come near to. I have no idea what you're talking about. Let me see. See what that verse is. Oops. What does it say? It says in Parsha Shlach. That's where you're quoting from. Send out for yourself. Those are gonna I don't know, maybe quoting wrong. 1 second. Says, send out for yourself men who will scout the land, which I am giving to the children of Israel. Send one man each for his father's tribe. Each one shall be a chieftain in the midst. So I'm not sure what you're quoting because that's not the same. That's not the same quote. Does it show predestination or pre-selection? We have free choice. What do you mean? God knows what we're going to do. God absolutely knows what we're going to do. If God knows what we're going to do, does that mean we're not have free choice? I think free choice is limited. 100%, I think free choice is limited. But at the end of the day, whatever we do, whatever action we do, we're held liable for. We are held liable for. Yeah, you could say, well, God knew you're going to do it, so he can't punish you. Well, we're not robots. And any Jew out there listening right now who wants to eat a ham sandwich, no one's going to put a gun to that and blow their brains out if they do it. They got free choice. Absolutely have free choice. God knows the choice you're going to make. Doesn't matter. You made the choice. Once you made the choice, the only question is if God takes away your free choice. So that we've seen a few times in history. You see in the book of Exodus, God took away Pharaoh's free choice. So that's the whole question. So how can God punish him? God took away his free choice. So some say he didn't take away 100% of his free choice, but made it very, very hard for him. Right? Because you have an obvious question. If you don't have free choice, God takes it away, then he can't punish you. It's not fair if he punishes you, took away free choice. But my Rabbi said many times that if a person sins, they keep doing the same thing over and over and over again, and they can't stop or whatever level. Who says your free choice has not been taken away? Even today. Because you can't fight against it. Like for you, it's impossible to fight against, whatever it is. Does that mean your free choice is taken away or not? He says you got to be very fearful for such a thing. You got to be very careful. Maybe in some cases, the free choice has been taken away. And the only question is how much you're going to get punished for. Okay. But in general, does the person have free choice? They absolutely have free choice. It doesn't really matter. I mean, I think it's limited, but it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter if God knows what you're going to do. That has no relevance. Even if God knows what you're going to do, you still have to do it. So you're going to say, but God knows you're going to do it. Very good. So why are you doing it? Your free choice. Maybe, maybe you're influenced by the evil inclination, which we all are. Very good. We're all influenced by our evil inclination. Some people have stronger in this area, stronger in that area, whatever it may be. Does that mean I don't have free choice? I have free choice. For sure I have free choice. 1 second. All right, next question. Why do we read the Torah portion in Aramaic? Aramaic's holy language. It's also a holy language. Let's say better. That was the language they understood. Yeah? That was the language they understood. Right? Why do you learn Gemara in Aramaic? It's mostly Aramaic and Hebrew. Right? It's a mixture of Aramaic and Hebrew. Yeah. Why was it not just only in Hebrew? Because that's the language they spoke. In the Jerusalem Talmud, it's easier in many ways than going through the Babylonian Talmud. It's a lot easier in many ways than going through the Jerusalem Talmud. Even though, we do take into account what the Jerusalem Talmud says, but if there's a disagreement usually between the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud, we go according to the Babylonian Talmud. Yeah, it's more authoritative. More, we hold it's more authoritative. So now the question is going to be very good that someone says your Torah works that Aramaic is in between language. Okay, could be, could be. Well, the fact is that's the language they spoke, right? They're going to say, "Well, we don't speak that language." Well, think about it. If a person learned enough Gemara, right, and Gemara is in Aramaic, then reading the Aramaic translation is no big shakes. It's not really that hard. Yeah. Because you already know most of the words in Aramaic anyway. So since you know it, then you see how the Aramaic translation is. Right? So you say it's somewhere in between, okay, but it's something we should know, something we should understand. If a person, let's say, grew up religious or came to Judaism later, whatever it is, or they converted, they learn enough Gemara, this is not going to be a problem. It's for sure not going to be a problem. But today, let's say some people have difficulty with it. Okay, so some would say you want to fulfill that obligation, you read in English. You can read English, or you can read Rashi. Right? Some say you should read Rashi anyway. Someone asks, are women equal with men? No. They're different. Men have a greater obligation of learning than women do. A woman is not going to be punished, if she's dealing with her kids, let's say, instead of learning. She got different obligations. Right? According to some rabbinic authorities, a woman has little kids, a bunch of little kids. She's exempt 100% from prayer. Now we say either she's obligated to pray at least once or twice a day. Some hold, even if she has little kids, she doesn't pray at all. Because she got other responsibilities. Kashrus in the house. It's on the woman. I mean, obviously a man has to know, the laws, what happens, something, gets strafed up, something gets messed up, what do you do? Okay. Plenty of things though that she has to know. Laws of family purity laws. Guys relying on his wife. She's checked herself a number of times and whatever. Right? We'll keep this clean. Right? No pun intended. He's relying on her. She has to know these things. Now, does that mean she's greater in that? He has to know the laws also. No question he has to know the laws. She has to know basic things, what she needs to do. And what's the question, and what maybe not be a question, or, whatever. They have different obligations. It's not a question who's greater or not. There are different obligations. I've spoken about this before. If men and women were created exactly the same, then women would have to pray 3 times a day with a minyan like men. But what are you going to do? You have little kids, this, that. So what do? You got a babysitter, you work it out. But they're not created equal. It's not a question of who's better. Right? People will get, feminists will say, yeah, women can't do this, women can't do that. There's a good reason why things are separate. There's a very good reason why. If a woman doesn't have little kids, she wants to get up in the morning and pray with men, let her. What's the problem? What's the problem? She wants to go to synagogue every day, and pray with the minyan. What's the problem? Not a problem. Obligation? She doesn't have an obligation. Right? And nobody says, by the way, when she's older, she has to go to minyan 3 times a day. Nobody says that. I mean, if she wants to, she can. She doesn't have the obligation. Right? Certainly she doesn't have an obligation when she's younger and she has kids around. Certainly she doesn't have that obligation. If she would have the same obligation, it wouldn't be fair. Would not be fair. Then you got to say, what are you going to do? You find a babysitter, you got to do something. Right? So that wouldn't be the case. That's, women are upheld, in the higher standard. Feminists say, no, it's apologetics, it's this, it's that. But think about it. What saved the Jewish people in Egypt? The women. Right? The story of Esther. Right? Who saved the Jewish people in Shushan? Yeah, it was Esther. But people say, yeah, but women can't do this, women can't do that. So they want to say women have, are equal to men. Equally, they have the same obligation, but you see, they don't. So it's not a question. It's not a question, it's not a question, oh, we're born the same. Well, guess what? If you look at the human body, there are a few differences, right? A rabbi once, was giving this class on, a bunch of feminists. right? So he's talking about, women's role in Judaism. So he says, okay, I want to ask you, is there any difference between men and women? Right? So what does the feminist say? No. There's no difference. He goes, okay, let me ask the question again. Is there any difference? Anything you can think of? He goes, I can think of one. Women can have children, men can't. Still, men can't have children. No matter what they do, they can't have children. Yeah, biologically, men cannot have children. That's a difference, isn't it? Well, if you have a difference, oversimplifying here, but if there's a difference in physical terms, isn't there a difference? Couldn't there be differences in spiritual terms? There could be a difference. Yeah. So they're not born the same. We hold women up to the highest standards. Should be held up to the highest standards. The eager education of a person's kids goes through his wife, not through the father. Even though father's got, it's got to teach them, it's got to work with them, very good. But when they're younger, where does the kid get the education? From his mother, not from his father. Comes from the mother. She's there all the time. He's not. Yeah. So they have different obligations. Someone asks, since always mincha is half an hour before chatzos. I don't think it's half an hour before. And women are not talking about we make mincha before the halachic time, or should wait until after. Even though women don't have the same obligation, they should pray. If they're going to pray the afternoon service, pray at the right time. Don't pray before. You don't want to run into problems, right? So even if you don't have the same obligation, doesn't matter, right? You want to pray at the right time. So today halachic midday is late, right? Today, like the earliest time you could pray, at least here, is like 1:20. Like 1:20 and a half or something. It's going to start getting earlier soon. But before that, you can't pray. You can't pray the afternoon service, right? You got to pray, but you got to pray, at the right time. In the winter, it's different. Let's say halachic midday is 12 o'clock. So what's the earliest time you can pray? It's about 12:30, 12:20, 12:30, something like that. That's fine. But you don't pray earlier than that. You pray at the right time, right? That you pray at the right time. Someone here mentions, Rabbi Tovi Singer, during the time of the Second Temple period, the main language spoken of Israel was Aramaic. Yeah, it makes sense. From all the people that came back, that was the language, right? Definitely don't disagree with that. But again, you come from anywhere else, and you're learning it thousands of years later, that's not your language. You speak French, Spanish, Italian, German, whatever, English. But it's not Aramaic, so you got to learn Aramaic. Now, a lot of the Aramaic words, a lot of the roots of the words come from Hebrew words, right? It's just the endings are a little bit different. Sometimes depending on the context, you can have words that, may look like, certain Hebrew words, but the meaning may be very different. When you get that more esoteric text, let's say, we call it Gadita, like, some stories, in the Talmud, which I would always say it either takes you 5 minutes or 5 years, to learn it. Some of those words are like the most difficult words, only use like once. They only use like once throughout, throughout the entire Talmud. Yeah, so those are much harder, I think, to go through. But you're right, that was the language, right? That was the language, of the day. But again, I would say if a person's learned enough Gemara, right? If they've learned enough Gemara, then I would say it's a lot. Then going through the Aramaic translation, right, shouldn't be a problem. Should not be a problem for them. It might be a little bit tedious or whatever, but okay, you'll get the gist of what's going on. You for sure get the gist of what's going on. And that was the language they spoke. Right. So again, we're 2,000 years later. Very good. Doesn't really matter. But the fact is, the person learned enough Gemara, that wouldn't be a problem. That shouldn't be a problem. But the average person, right? Obviously, most secular Jews obviously not going to learn that. They wouldn't have a clue. They barely read Hebrew. But anyone who's grown up, let's say, in the system or became religious later, it's not going to matter. Because the more Gemara that they learn, the more Aramaic they have down and how they understand the words, it's not going to be a problem. Somebody asks, is there a handbook that covers the practical stuff we need? Yes. Sent it out in the syllabus. Right? What are the main things? I don't even have to send it in the syllabus. What are the main things a JIT, a Jew in training, needs to know for conversion? The exact same thing, the most important things that Jews need to know. What do they need to know? The laws of kashrus, the laws of blessings, the laws of Shabbos, the laws of prayer, the 13 principles of faith, and all the holidays. Right? You got to learn Hebrew also. Right? I'll throw in Hebrew also. That's the only thing everybody knows I don't teach, but that's the only and you have to know Hebrew in order to be able to follow a prayer service. No rabbinical court whatsoever is going to care that you speak Hebrew. Even if they're Zionistic, they're not going to care if you speak Hebrew or not. They want to see you can follow a prayer service, you can read in a prayer book. That's the most important thing. That's the most important thing. Now, someone tell me, what about learning Musar? That's good. Learning Torah portion of the week. That's good. Learning Jewish philosophy. That's good. Right? But what's the essence? The essence, prayer, kashrus, Shabbos, blessings, 13 principles of faith. That's, and all the holidays. All the laws dealing with the holidays. Intermediate days of the holidays, that's the important thing. That's what they're going to ask you on. Again, I'm not saying they won't ask, they won't ask questions maybe in Chumash or whatever. So I'll tell you a funny story. I mean, it's a pretty sad story. One of the people in the Knesset, whatever, a secular Jew, obviously, was complaining to the chief rabbis, at that time. I don't remember who they were, but was complaining that conversion, the Orthodox, we make it so hard for people to convert. There's just so much information they have to know, and there's a lot of confusing things out there. So they say, like what? What's too hard? What do we make too hard? Well, one of the questions that people get asked is, who is Moshe Rabbeinu? You can't make this stuff up. You're like that's too hard of a question. Who is Moshe Rabbeinu? I mean, I think maybe some secular Jews don't know who Moshe Rabbeinu is, right? Probably most secular Jews do, because they probably saw 10 Commandments. They probably saw the movie 10 Commandments. Are you serious? Right? There was a rabbi who taught in a secular school, and the principal made him sign an affidavit that wasn't going to try and convert people, quote unquote, to be Orthodox Jews, right? So before Shavuos, they didn't want them. Obviously, this principal did not want this rabbi trying to convince them to keep Torah mitzvahs. So they had an assembly, comes in to speak. 400 kids. 400 kids. I mean, this is no joke. This happened. Yeah. It's one of my favorite stories. A very sad story. So he gets up there and he says, who wrote the book of Tehillim? This is Israelis. We're not talking about, Hicks living in the middle of nowhere, right? These are Israeli kids. Israeli kids in Tel Aviv. Yeah. Who wrote the book of Tehillim? No answers. No answers. The principal is looking for a place to hide. Nobody knows who wrote the book of Tehillim, who wrote the book of Psalms. So the rabbi says, okay, I'll give you a hint. Imagine you're going to give these kids a hint. I'll give you a hint. So he says, David, as in David HaMelech, right? And he says, David, and they all scream out, Ben-Gurion! The first prime minister of the land of Israel, yeah? Big difference, I think, between David HaMelech and David Ben-Gurion. It's a pathetic story. You really want to think David Ben-Gurion wrote the book of Psalms? So someone's like, can you come twice a week? Teach these kids a little bit about Judaism? They know nothing. They know how to speak Hebrew very good. They know nothing. Think David Ben-Gurion wrote the book of Psalms? That's pretty pathetic. Pretty pathetic. Yeah. So, isn't it good to, to read the book of Psalms also? Sure. Is it one of the criteria? No. They want you to know how to pray from a prayer book. They want you to know how to follow a prayer service. They don't care if you speak Hebrew or not, like an Israeli. That doesn't matter. But they want you to know basic things. And again, what are the basic things? Shabbos, kashrus, blessings, prayer, holidays. Yeah, this is what they want you to know. Those are the basic, things. Anything else you learn, Chumash you need to know, really you should know. I'm not going to ask you that, but really, Torah portion of the week, every week you should go through. More so you should learn now and then. Jewish philosophy you should go through. I mean, these are important things, but the other things are more crucial, as I would say. Somebody asked, since we are in mourning, we don't sing. It's praying to Don Olam and like singing, is that wrong? No. You can sing. Who said you can't sing? You just can't use music. Doesn't mean we're singing and dancing in synagogue. Yeah, that's a problem. I would say even during the 3 weeks, dancing, dancing during prayer, yeah, probably shouldn't do. Right? That probably shouldn't be done. Right? But singing, who said you can't sing? You're allowed to sing. Right? That's not a problem. You're allowed to sing. Somebody asks, so again, dancing would be a problem. Singing and dancing would be a problem. Singing by itself is not a problem. Right? So on Shabbos, it's not a problem. So during the week shouldn't be a problem. Somebody asked, can I peel hard-boiled eggs and make egg salad on Shabbos? If they're already hard-boiled, you can peel them. 100%. You can peel them. You can't use anything to peel them, that would be selection, right? Doesn't matter. You break the shell, that's not a problem. Shell's going to be muksa, so you're going to put the shell somewhere and just throw them out. Put them on a plate, put them on a napkin or something. Now, making egg salads, you can't mash potatoes on Shabbos, that'd be a problem. And the only thing about making egg salad, you want to be careful if you put in mayonnaise. Mayonnaise, if you make it too thick, it makes it one entity. If it makes it one entity, it could be a prohibition of kneading, right? You make it into like one thick paste. If you put a little bit of what do you call it? You put a little bit of mayonnaise there, probably not a problem. If you put enough mayonnaise there, and it makes it thicker, that'd be a problem. That is probably a problem. Unless let's say the potatoes are cut, they're not cut very small. If the potatoes, let's say, are cut relatively small, and now you want to put in mayonnaise, making your potato salad, that's going to be a problem. If the potato slices were cut bigger, then it's probably less of an issue, but you shouldn't put too much. You shouldn't put too much mayonnaise in general, because it will make it into a paste. So I would say it's probably better make it before Shabbos. Yeah, if you didn't make it before Shabbos, do not add too much mayonnaise. That would take you that would take you out of the problem. And what about tuna? Let's say you had tuna, now you want to put mayonnaise, let's say you already had tuna made, you want to add more mayonnaise. Yeah, so also you say there's already mayonnaise in it. Okay. Even if there's mayonnaise in it, if I had more mayonnaise, I make it thicker, so that might be a problem, even if there's mayonnaise already in it. So usually mayonnaise in general is an issue. That's why there's a company that created a squirt bottle. They created what they call mayonnaise. What's mayonnaise? It's a mixture of chrein, which is horseradish in Yiddish. They mix horseradish and mayonnaise together. One squirt bottle. So what would people do? If you can filter fish, on Shabbos, people like to put mayonnaise and horseradish on it together. Now, what happened? Well, so what's the problem? So you take the horseradish and mix it with the mayonnaise. So that's a problem. That would be a problem, because even it's right at the meal, that would be a problem because you're making it thicker. You end up making it thicker, right? So someone came up with the idea. So instead of people potentially making a mistake by doing that, so they created a bottle of it, so you don't have a problem, right? As long as you open the bottle before Shabbos, you're good, right? So you just squirt it. So it's already a mixture. You don't have a problem. Nothing else is being added. It's already a mixture. But if I mix it together, that would be a problem, right? That would be a problem. So they took you out of the problem. So if you like horseradish and mayonnaise together, so you can buy this bottle and that'll take you out of the problem. Or you just don't mix them, right? Either way. But yeah, so this was many years ago. Someone came up with the ingenious idea, so it wouldn't put a stumbling block in front of people. But again, that's if you're using both. If you only use horseradish, then you don't have a problem. If you only use mayonnaise, you don't have a problem. If you use both, that would be a problem, right? That would be an issue mixing them together. Someone asked, "I let Christians cook for me on Shabbos?" No, if you're Jewish now, that they're not allowed to cook. Everything has to be cooked ahead of time. They can't cook for you. That would be forbidden. If they're already, the problem is that they're cooking. The only way to get out of the problem, let's say during the week, can you allow them to cook for you during the week? So during the week, it's the problem because what we call bishul akum, it's a non-Jew cooking for you. Now, if you at the stove during the week, or you stirred up the food at some point, or you did something to help the process of cooking, that wouldn't be a problem. On Shabbos, you can't do that, right? You can't use a flame. I mean, let's say you have a closed flame. Even if you have a closed flame, someone can't cook for you, right? The question would be like this: if they were cooking for themselves, let's say, I'll make it easy. Let's say something's already cooked. Something's already cooked. They're reheating it. Okay, they're reheating it. And they're doing it for themselves. They're doing it for themselves. There's no cooking problem, no kashrus problem. Now the only thing is, they're doing it for you. You wouldn't have eaten it otherwise. So that's the problem, right? If they were doing it for yourself, if they were doing it for themselves, and the whole thing is kosher, we don't have any issues, no cooking issues, no kashrus issues. You have no issues. If they were doing it for themselves, and then they offer it for you, then you could probably eat it. Why? Because they're not doing it for you. If they're specifically doing it for you, that's the problem, right? That would, if you got around all the other problems, which probably you won't, but if you got around the other problems, that would still be a problem, right? That would still be a problem because they're doing it. They're doing it for you. What if someone was sick? Could an non-Jew cook if you were sick? If you were sick. So again, similar thing, right? It'd be a similar thing. I know that you might be able to get benefit from, because the person's sick. Now, what about somebody else? What about someone else comes, walking down, they see this great food. Again, let's say it's not a kashrus issue, right? But they're only doing it because the person's sick. So the fact they're doing it for someone who's sick, someone who's healthy can't eat from it, right? They would have done it otherwise. If they were going to do it otherwise, they want a sick person, it's different. It's a different issue. That is, but I would say it's a bigger problem. I mean, this is a bigger problem on Shabbos, but it's still a problem during the week, unless it's something that's already been cooked, it's already kosher, you don't have any issues with it. The only question is you're reheating it. If you're reheating it, not a problem, right? If they're reheating it, not a problem. But if not, you have to have some portion in the cooking during the week, otherwise it would be forbidden. Now that means you turn the flame up high enough that'll cook it, or you stir it, or you do something. You have to do something in the preparation of it, right? Of the cooking process, right? Either you turn up the flame very high, or you stir it, or you stir it. Even if what you do is not going to finish the cooking, doesn't matter. Fact is, either you turn up the flame very high, and if it just sat there, it would cook it, so that wouldn't be a problem. Or even if they turn on the flame, yeah, so you can turn it off, turn it back on. You could do that, or you could stir it, right? If you stir it, that helps the cooking process. That would take you out of the problem. That would take you out of that problem. Yeah. Any other questions? Now, I forgot to mention one other thing. When you mention Christians, doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter if they're idolaters or even if they're Muslims, right? Even if we do hold that Islam is not idolatry. Nonetheless, I mean, there are opinions that do hold it's idolatry, but it doesn't matter. We hold, practically speaking, it's not idolatry. So if any non-Jew, I'm not gonna say Christians there, Buddhists, the Muslim, doesn't really matter whether they're idolatrous or not. Come under the same category. So it's not gonna matter. It's not gonna matter what level of idolatry they do or not. Non-Jews in general shouldn't be cooking for Jews. right? There are ways around it. We explained how you get around the problem, right? Shabbos, you won't get around the problem. Shabbos, you're gonna have more difficulty getting around the problem. During the week, it's a lot easier to get around the problem. Yeah. Any other questions? So I want to ask, can have your service do anything contradictory to what you would do during Shabbos? They can do things for themselves. I had a question many years ago when I was in South America. We had a maid, and she'd wash the dishes on Shabbos. So I asked my Rabbi, can you wash them in hot water? Right? Because we wouldn't allow in hot water in general, because if there's anything left over, you might be cooking it. Okay. So basically said, if that's how she enjoys doing it, you don't have to stop her. Right? You don't have to stop her. So in that case, I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't put hot water, even if I would wash dishes on Shabbos, you don't put hot water on them. Because if you have any leftover residue, you might cook them. Right? So everyone would agree you're not allowed to do that. Well, what about a non-Jew? They're not obligated. Right? So if you have, a person had a maid and they were cleaning up or whatever, and they wanted to wash the dishes in hot water, you don't have to stop them. For sure you don't have to stop them. If it's making their life easier. Yeah. So maid we have, she loves Shabbos. So very easy. And it's very easy. So in many ways. But in general, in general, you can't tell her to do it. Certain things you can hint at, but you can't tell them directly, right? Say, wow, it's dark in here. And they turn on the light. So that's okay. Now, if they turn on the light in general because they wanted the light, then I could get benefit from it. But you can't tell them directly, right? Famous story I always tell, someone, the rabbi in the synagogue on Shabbos tells one of his congregants, tell the janitor to turn on the heat, it's cold. Right? Again, you're only allowed to tell in a hint. You're not allowed to tell directly. So they're trying to hint and this and that, and the janitor's not getting it. So finally they go back to the rabbi. They're like, we couldn't do it. He didn't figure it out. So it's fine. I'll take care of it. So the rabbi goes up to him. He tells the janitor, says, turn on the heat. It's cold. Yeah. So the congregants are astonished. They're like, how could you do that? Then the rabbi say you're only allowed to do that. You're only allowed to do it when it's a hint. You can only tell him at a hint. He said, don't worry, for him that was a hint. For him that was the hint. Yeah. So again, you can't tell him direct. Tell him direct is forbidden. Definitely, so in a lot of communities they have a Shabbos goy. So they have someone, coming around, or they get a hold of them, and let's say electricity went out, other things happen. So he knows, he knows more or less what to do. Knows what to do. And at the end of the day, he comes, he tries this, he tries that, he tries the other thing, he fixes it. But again, you gotta be very careful. You gotta be very careful because you can't tell him directly. But that's what he does. Yeah, and he gets paid for that also. I mean, it's part of what he does during the week also. So you're not paying him directly for Shabbos, but you're paying him. Right? So, he knows, and everybody knows, wink, wink, wink. I got a problem here. And he'll come in and say, okay, what's the problem? So that's permissible. It's permissible. You don't have to tell him directly. We had a problem once, electricity went out. And whatever, it was very hot. So we got someone to come in. So he walks in the door, and he's like, all right, what's the problem? So we look around. Everyone looks around, like, oh, electricity. So he starts fighting with all the breakers, with all the circuit breakers, right? And whatever, figured out which one was which one was the problematic one, and whatever. So again, you can't tell them direct, but some people make that mistake. It's a lot more complicated than it sounds. It's not so simple. Not so simple. But the general rule is you can't tell a non-Jew to do something directly. You're not allowed to tell them directly to do it. It has to be in an indirect way. But if they do it in an indirect way, you can get benefit from it. You tell the maid during the week, follow you around on Shabbos, turn the lights on and off for you. She's doing it specifically for you, right? If she does it, oh, 1 second. Interesting question. 1 second. You told her before. You told her before. If you told her before, it shouldn't be a problem. Right? She's probably doing it for herself also, potentially. But even if not, you told her before, that's part of her job. Right? Make sure all the lights are out. So yeah, that should be all right. Or you can just tell her, you don't have to follow you around, just tell her which light you want shut off, on Shabbos. You can do that. Before Shabbos. Can't say on Shabbos, but yeah, before Shabbos you could do that. 1 second. Can a non-Jew nurse or doctor for a Jew in the hospital? Yeah, that's not a problem. I would say it's better to use, a Jewish doctor or nurse if possible, but that's not the case. Certainly use a non-Jew. Also, what about the Jews in the hospital? How would the Jew eat? Well, you get someone that's obviously taking care of them. Would make sure they have kosher food, right? They have a loved one that is looking after them. If they, as long as they're not incapacitated, then they can demand kosher food. Yeah, they can certainly demand kosher food, but usually someone's sick unless they're like alone in the world and someone has any connection to them. Yeah, then they wouldn't know. Then essentially they wouldn't know. But a lot of people usually have family or some family that should know that. And if not, what happens? Yeah, it's a problem. That would be a problem because they're not going to know, and they can just feed them treif. Yeah. So how would you know that? How would they know that? Good question. They wouldn't know that. Would it be part of their records per se? I don't know. Maybe it would be. Maybe it would be. Not sure. Not sure, but it could be. Right. Could be. Could be that they wouldn't know, and because they wouldn't know, they end up serving them treif. But usually, they have a family member or someone that knows them that we know they keep kosher, so they get demand. They can certainly demand it. Whatever automatic lights turn on and off when you walk in the room on Shabbos. That's a whole question. That is a whole question. Because there are sensors. There are sensors. That's a problem. There's no way around that problem. That's a problem. If you walk by someone's house and lights go on when you walk by, okay, you did it inadvertently, you didn't know. But if you're causing those lights to go on, you got to be careful. In this case, it's no different. You open up a fridge, it's got a light on it. You got to either unscrew the light bulb if they make fridges like that, or you got to do it in such a way you turn off the light. Otherwise, you got a problem. You can't do that. That's forbidden. So you got to dismantle it before Shabbos, right? That's what you have to do. You can't do it. That would be forbidden. Can a Jew donate blood or an organ to a? Sorry, can a non-Jew donate blood or an organ to a Jew? Yeah, why not? You're gonna say their blood is spiritual cooties? Maybe. No, but they could. Definitely could. They had an issue here many years ago. Many years ago when Ethiopians started coming, they took their blood, they donated blood or whatever. They took their blood and destroyed it. They found out they destroyed it because they're worried about AIDS. They're worried about AIDS. Caused a whole problem here, whole political scandal here because of it. But in general, if you didn't have that issue or health issues, then yeah, then you certainly could. Yeah, not a problem. Yeah. Any other questions? Just want to mention ideas. Just the before mentioned ideas as much as possible. I forget what the question was. No, as much as possible, whatever it is, whatever you need should be okay. Yeah, as long as it doesn't contradict Shabbos. If the general rule is, if it is, what's the word? If they're doing it for themselves, then it's okay. You don't have to stop them. If it's for your benefit, that's going to be a problem. Anything they're going to do necessary for your benefit, right, might be a problem. Now, if part of the deal is they wash the dishes, they clean up, they do these other things, okay, right? So that's what they do. That's not a problem, right? That would be a problem. They want to wash the dishes. You don't necessarily want them to, but makes their life easier if they want to wash the dishes. Okay, yeah, they want to wash the dishes in hot water. Do I have to stop them? No. They want to do other things. I don't have to stop them necessarily. It depends, right? It depends what it is. If they're doing it for themselves, not a problem. If they do it to make their life easier, also not a problem, right? Again, it depends. It's much more. It depends on the issue. All right, I gotta stop here. I just every Tuesday and Thursday, 10 o'clock Eastern Time, 5 o'clock Israel time. Anyone has any questions, find me on Facebook at Michael Chaim Kaufman, Beyond Orthodox Conversion Judaism, orthodoxconversion.com. Beyond Orthodox Conversion Judaism on Judaism on YouTube. There I got videos and Q&As, ethics for our fathers. Local Leviticus, you want to send me an email, rabbichaimkaufman@gmail.com, RBBI, CHAIM, COFFMAN @gmail.com. Wish have a good beginning of the day.